Ohio, spring of 1946. The war was over, but in the quiet streets of small towns like Fremont, the silence said more than any parade. America was rebuilding, not its cities, but its people. The boys who left in uniform were coming home as men changed by things they couldn't speak of. Some returned to sweethearts who waited, some to empty houses. And some, like James Whitaker, came back with a letter in their pocket and a hope they'd been carrying for far too long. Jimmy, to anyone who knew him before the war, had left in 1942 with a promise. Not a medal, not a photograph, but a letter. Folded neatly, ink slightly smudged, written by Margaret Collins, the girl he planned to marry. They'd grown up together. Sunday church, summer fairs, late-night talks on the front porch. Her letter was short but sincere. No matter how long it takes, I'll be here, waiting for you. Yours always, Maggie. And that letter lived in his chest, sewn into the lining of his jacket when he fought through France, soaked with sweat during the Ardennes, and nearly destroyed in the cold hell of the POW camp in Germany. Through hunger, frostbite, and the silence of barbed wire, it was that letter, not orders, not prayers, that kept him breathing. When the war ended and the gates of the prison opened, James walked home a thinner, older version of the boy who had kissed her goodbye under the willow tree near the river. Every mile closer to home, he imagined her, standing on that same porch, letter in hand, heart still his. But the world had moved on. His house was still there, though the roof sagged and the yard was overgrown. His father had passed. His mother now lived with an aunt in Toledo, and Maggie, she didn't live next door anymore. A neighbor, hesitant to speak, finally told him, "She's married now, lives out near Bowling Green, got a little boy too." James stood at the edge of the town that had raised him, the letter still folded in his pocket, heavier now than ever. He hadn't read it in months, didn't need to. He knew every word. But what do you do when the one thing that kept you alive doesn't live for you anymore? He didn't want answers, just to see her face one more time, to give back the letter she once gave in hope, and carry the silence with the dignity only a soldier can understand. If this story is already pulling at your heart the way it pulled at mine while writing it, leave a like and subscribe. We share true stories every day, stories that move, surprise, and stay with you. And now, get ready, because what comes next changes everything. When James stepped off the Greyhound bus, he half expected someone to be waiting, a familiar face, a wave, maybe a kid from school, now grown into a store clerk. But no one met him at the depot, just the driver unloading bags and the sound of tires over gravel. The sky was wide and quiet, the same as it always was, but everything else felt foreign. He walked the 6 blocks from Main Street to where his childhood home had stood for decades, a white clapboard house with blue shutters and a porch swing that creaked in the summer breeze. But what he found instead was a husk. The house was still there, technically, but the yard was overgrown, the windows broken, and the door hanging from one hinge. It looked like a house that had been waiting for someone who never came home. He stood in the front yard for a long time, looking at the empty porch, half expecting the screen door to open and his mother to call out, "Jimmy, that you?" But no voice came. No light flicked on inside. He walked up the steps. They groaned under his boots and stepped into a silence thicker than any he had known in the war. Inside, the furniture was gone. Dust covered everything. There were old newspapers in the corner, one of them announcing "Victory in Europe." He picked it up, ran his fingers over the headline, and folded it under his arm. Maybe he'd keep it, just to prove the world once declared an end to hell. The kitchen was empty, the smell of coffee, of biscuits, of Sunday mornings, all gone. He stood in the doorway where his father used to read the paper and slowly turned around. Nothing was left, except the echoes. Neighbors had changed, some moved away, some hadn't made it through the war. The old woman who lived across the street, Mrs. Dempsey, was still alive. She recognized him immediately, her eyes wide with shock, but her voice soft. "James Whittaker. My lord, we thought you died over there." He shook his head. "Almost, but not quite." She hesitated, then pulled her cardigan tighter and motioned toward her porch. "Your mama's in Toledo now, stays with your Aunt Edna. And Maggie, well," he looked at her, already knowing what was coming. "She moved out to Bowling Green, got married last summer, to a fella from the county office. Nice man. They've got a little boy. Good family." James thanked her, politely, quietly, like someone receiving condolences, not information. He didn't ask for more. He didn't need to. That night, he stayed in a small room above the barber shop where his father used to get haircuts. The barber remembered him, called him Sergeant, and handed him a bottle of soda like nothing had changed. But James could feel it. Everything had. He sat on the edge of the bed and pulled the letter from his pocket. The paper was softer now, folded and unfolded so many times it barely held together. He didn't read it. He didn't need to. The words were carved into him. "I'll wait for you. Always." He ran his fingers along the edge and wondered, did she ever reread it? Did she hold onto her copy like he held onto his? In the days that followed, he wandered the town, walking old routes, the creek behind the school, the diner where he'd bought her milkshakes, the park where they kissed behind the bandstand. Everything was still there, but smaller, quieter, like it had been sealed in time. The letter remained in his pocket. He'd thought about burning it once, in France, during a bombardment, thought maybe letting it go would free him. But he hadn't, and now he understood why. That letter had been the only steady thing in a world that shifted under his feet. It had kept him moving, and now, even if it was no longer true, it still mattered. On the third day, he found himself standing outside a small home in Bowling Green. He hadn't meant to go there. He'd taken the train on a whim, no plan in mind, but there he was, on a quiet street, with tulips growing in the yard, and a child's red wagon tipped over near the porch, and inside, a life that didn't include him anymore. There were nights when James Whittaker didn't think he'd make it till morning. Nights when the cold cut deeper than the shrapnel, when the silence between artillery rounds sounded louder than the explosions themselves. In those moments, tucked inside the inner pocket of his field jacket, was the one thing that kept him from falling apart: Maggie's letter. She had written it before he shipped out in the late summer of 1942. The ink was slightly smeared from her tears. He knew that even before she admitted it. He'd memorized every word on the ship to Europe, read it again in a foxhole outside Bastogne, held it like a Bible in the freezing dark of a German POW camp. "I'll wait for you, no matter how long. I'll be here, Jimmy, always." He didn't believe in miracles, not after what he'd seen. But that letter was the closest thing to one. When men around him collapsed into despair or silence, James kept reading. It wasn't that the letter made the war go away. It just reminded him there was something else, something after. In the Ardennes, when snow turned blood red in the trenches and every footstep crunched with death, he took the letter out at night and read it under a piece of canvas. Just touching her handwriting steadied his hands. Just imagining her voice saying those words gave him warmth the fire couldn't. Once, during a surprise German counterattack, a shell landed near their position. James was thrown into the mud, dazed, bleeding from the ear. But the first thing he checked, before his legs, before his weapon, was the letter. He found it soaked but whole. That night, he dried it over a candle and thanked God, not for saving his life, but for saving her words. Then came capture. He never talked about those months in the camp, not to his mother, not to the VA doctors, not even in the memoir he started later and never finished. But the letter was there too, hidden inside the lining of his coat, sewn in with trembling hands during the early days of captivity. Some guards suspected. One even tried to take it. James nearly killed him. There were days when he didn't speak, didn't eat. But he'd touch that place in his coat where the letter was and whisper her name. Maggie, Maggie, Maggie. Other prisoners had tokens too. A ring, a photo, a scrap of paper with a child's drawing. But for James, it was the letter. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about survival, identity, humanity. The words reminded him he was still a man, still loved, still someone worth coming home to. When liberation finally came and he stepped outside the barbed wire under grey skies and skinny limbs, the letter came with him. The paper was brittle, yellowed, but the ink had survived. Back in America, he was changed, quieter, older, and in his silence, people assumed many things, that he was strong, that he was lucky, that he was whole. But James knew the truth. The war had taken everything but that one thing, a promise on paper, one sentence that held more meaning than medals or flags. And now, standing on a sidewalk in front of a house that wasn't his, with tulips blooming and the echo of a child's laughter inside, he felt that letter shift in his pocket, like it knew something he didn't, because sometimes the thing that saves you isn't meant to stay. James stood across the street from the little house on Sycamore Lane for a long time. It was the kind of home people dreamed about in the war. White fence, trimmed lawn, laundry fluttering on the line. There was a bicycle leaning against the porch, a swing hanging from the tree, and flower boxes blooming beneath the windows. It looked like peace, and inside was Maggie, the girl he'd written letters to in his mind every night for 3 years, the girl whose words had kept him alive, the girl who had promised, "I'll wait." He didn't knock right away, just watched, until the front door opened. She stepped out holding a laundry basket, her hair tied back in a red scarf, wearing a dress that made her look older than he remembered. Or maybe just more real. She froze when she saw him. Not in fear, not in joy, just in recognition. Jimmy? His name left her lips like a question, like she wasn't sure if he was real. He nodded. "Hi, Maggie." She set the basket down slowly, her hands trembling. They told us you died in a POW camp." He shrugged lightly. "Almost." A silence fell between them. One of those long, heavy silences that carries too much to break easily. He looked at her, really looked. Her eyes hadn't changed, still the same deep hazel that once made him forget the world. But now they held something else. Life, history, and something like guilt. A small boy ran out the door behind her. Blonde hair, round face. Couldn't have been older than 3. He stopped short when he saw James and clung to Maggie's leg. "Is this your—" She nodded before he could finish. "His name's Tommy." James smiled softly. "He looks like you." She didn't smile back, just looked down, brushed the boy's hair, and whispered something to him. He ran back inside. "You want to come in?" she asked quietly. He hesitated, then followed. The inside of the house was warm, full of the scent of baking and sunlight and stories he hadn't been part of. There were toys in the corner, framed photos on the walls, one of her and a man in uniform, but not him. They sat in the kitchen, the same place he used to imagine coming home to. She poured him coffee. The mug shook slightly in her hand. "I wrote to you," she said finally. "Every week, for a year. Then they sent the telegram. I tried to hold on, Jimmy, I did." He nodded slowly. "You don't owe me an explanation." She looked at him then, tears forming in her eyes. "But I owe you the truth." She took a deep breath. "After the war ended, I waited. Even after the letter came, I couldn't let go. But people kept saying, 'You have to live, Maggie. You have to move on.' My mother got sick. We lost the house, and Charlie, he helped. He brought food. He fixed the roof. He was kind. And I was tired of waiting for ghosts." James didn't flinch. He just looked down into his coffee like it could offer a way out of the moment. "Is he good to you?" he asked. She nodded. "Yes, he is." He reached into his jacket and pulled out the letter. Maggie's handwriting was faded, but still there, still legible. He placed it on the table between them. This letter, it got me through everything. Cold, hunger, fear. It was more than words, Maggie. It was home. Her hands trembled as she picked it up, like holding her own past. She didn't unfold it, just held it to her chest and closed her eyes. "I never stopped loving you, Jimmy," she said, voice barely a whisper. "But the war changed us. All of us." He stood slowly, looked around the house. "I don't want to take anything from you. I just wanted to see you, to say thank you, for the letter, for saving my life." She followed him to the door. "Will you stay in town?" "Not sure," he replied. "Thought I'd see what's left." At the door, he paused. "Take care of him, of Tommy." She nodded. "I will." And then he stepped out into the light. The sun had shifted. The day was half gone, but he walked with steady feet. The letter was gone, but so was the weight. James didn't go back to Fremont after seeing Maggie. He didn't feel like he belonged there anymore. That little town with its faded storefronts and front porches had become a place frozen in a photograph. Something you look at, but no longer live inside. Instead, he boarded a train heading south, not because he had a plan, but because he needed distance. From her, from the letter, from the version of himself who had clung to promises made during a time when the world was falling apart. He carried little with him, just a duffel bag, a notebook, and memories that weighed more than any pack he'd worn during the war. The letter, now hers again, stayed behind, and with it, the burden he'd carried all those years. In Nashville, he took a job sweeping floors at a factory that made parts for tractors. The pay was modest, the hours long, but the rhythm of work was comforting. Each swing of the broom was a step further away from who he had been. The soldier, the captive, the man with a crumpled dream in his pocket. The people didn't ask many questions. They saw the look in his eyes and knew enough. The South was full of returning soldiers who had learned how to be quiet, men who smiled politely and carried ghosts in their shadows. At night, James sat in a small rented room above a diner, listening to the radio and writing in a leather-bound notebook. Not a diary, just thoughts, pieces of stories, fragments of moments that still haunted him. He wrote about the camp, about the cold, about the way the snow fell like ash on the mornings when hope was too heavy to hold. He wrote about the men who didn't make it, about the smell of wood smoke and death, and he wrote about Maggie, about her letter, the handwriting, the way he used to fold it like it was glass. But most of all, he wrote about silence, about the kind of silence that comes not when words are absent, but when they're no longer needed, the kind that fills the space after a goodbye that never really happened. Months passed, then years. James never married, not because he couldn't, but because some part of him had already been spoken for, not in the way of romance, but in the way of memory. He formed friendships, he read, he built shelves, he helped neighbors fix their porches after storms. He lived simply, not with sadness, but with a kind of quiet gratitude. In 1951, a man he worked with invited him to a veterans group downtown. At first, James refused. He didn't like the idea of sitting in a room full of stories he already knew too well. But he went. Once. Then again. He found that sharing helped, not because it erased the past, but because it gave it shape. Other men brought medals, photos, ration books. James brought nothing, only words. One night during a meeting, a young college student sat in the back taking notes. He was working on a project, an oral history of the war. After the session, he approached James and asked if he'd be willing to talk. James looked at the boy and saw someone who had never seen the world fall apart. But he nodded. He spoke softly, slowly, told him about the cold, the silence, the letter. He didn't name her, just said there was someone once who had given him a reason to keep breathing. The student wrote everything down. Later, he sent James a typed copy of the story with a note, Your words stayed with me long after the interview. Thank you for carrying that letter, for coming back." James placed the pages in his notebook, where they stayed for the rest of his life. In the spring of 1965, James Whittaker passed away peacefully in his sleep. He was 51, a quiet man in a quiet room, surrounded by the things he had built with his hands. There was no wife to call, no children. But neighbors came, factory workers, friends from the veterans group. A few stood by his grave and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. After his funeral, his landlord found the notebook in the drawer by his bed. She gave it to the Veterans Hall, who donated it to a local museum, along with a small brass nameplate that simply read, "James Whittaker. He carried a letter through war and came home a man of peace." Years later, a young woman visiting the museum read his story. She was researching love letters from wartime for her thesis. She took a picture of the plaque and wrote in her journal, "Sometimes love doesn't end in marriage or happily ever after. Sometimes it ends in dignity, in carrying something through hell and putting it down gently when the time is right." Decades later, long after the war, after the Cold War, after men stopped wearing hats and letters stopped arriving in mailboxes, a girl named Emily Whittaker found herself flipping through old archives in a small museum in Nashville. She was 24, working on her master's thesis in American history, focused on the emotional impact of World War II on returning soldiers. She wasn't looking for family, just for voices lost in footnotes. But when she came across a small brass nameplate in a glass case, she froze. James Whittaker. He carried a letter through war and came home a man of peace. Her heart skipped. She knew the name. Her grandfather had told stories of an uncle, quiet, distant, who'd never married, never returned home, but sent money every Christmas and always wrote his name in perfect script. She leaned in closer, and beside the plaque was a worn notebook. She read it, page after page of quiet grief, survival, reflection. But what struck her most wasn't the horror of war. It was the tenderness. The way James wrote about a letter, about a girl named Maggie, about carrying love like a lifeline, even after it no longer belonged to him. She asked for a copy, sat on the museum steps and cried, not out of sorrow, but because something about it felt so deeply human, real, beautiful in its quiet tragedy. Later, she found the final note he had written at the back of the notebook. A single line, "She didn't break my heart. She gave it back to me so I could carry it home." Emily turned his story into a paper, then a lecture, then a short film that was shown in classrooms and veteran centers. She called it "The Letter He Carried." And in every showing, someone cried, because we all carry something. And sometimes the greatest love story is the one that ends with grace. We publish true stories every day. If this one moved you as much as it moved me while writing it, leave a like and subscribe. It helps us share stories that heal, inspire, and stay with you.